In the middle of a war that was consuming Europe, while cities burned and millions were being transported to their deaths, a different kind of operation was quietly unfolding inside the bureaucratic machinery of the SS. There were no tanks assigned to it, no front lines, no maps marked with arrows and divisions. Instead, there were archives, dusty court records, yellowed parchments, handwritten confessions extracted centuries earlier under torture, lists of names, almost all women, dates, villages, methods of execution. The folders carried a single word on their covers: Hexen, witches. This was not the obsession of a fringe cultist or a rogue academic. It was an officially sanctioned SS research initiative, conducted under the authority of the Reich's most powerful paramilitary organization. While the Third Reich was fighting for survival, the SS was compiling one of the largest collections of witch trial documents ever assembled. The question is not whether this happened. The documents exist. The files survived. The real question is why. Why would a modern, industrialized regime, one that claimed to be built on science, racial biology, and technological superiority, invest time and resources into the medieval persecution of witches? The answer is far more disturbing than superstition. This was not about magic. It was about rewriting history. By the late 1930s, the Nazi state had already mastered the art of controlling the present. Through propaganda, terror, and mass surveillance, it dictated what people could say, read, and believe. But controlling the future was not enough. To justify its crimes, the regime needed to control the past. And buried in the archives of early modern Europe, the SS believed it had found a powerful weapon: the witch hunts. For centuries, the execution of tens of thousands, mostly women, had been framed as the result of religious fanaticism, fear, and superstition. To the Nazi worldview, this interpretation was not merely incomplete. It was unacceptable. Within SS ideology, history was not a neutral record of events. It was a battlefield. And on that battlefield, the witch trials could be transformed into proof of an ancient conspiracy: the systematic destruction of Germanic knowledge, culture, and blood. The victims, the SS claimed, were not witches at all. They were guardians of ancestral wisdom, carriers of racial memory, women who embodied a pre-Christian, pre-Roman, pure Germanic world. And the executioners? The church, foreign law, alien belief systems imposed on Europe. This reinterpretation did not emerge organically. It was engineered, deliberately, methodically, and with chilling precision. At the center of this effort stood Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. Himmler was not a battlefield commander in the traditional sense. He was an administrator, an organizer, and above all, an ideologue. He believed that the SS was not merely a security force, but a new ruling order, an elite brotherhood tasked with reshaping civilization itself. To Himmler, history was not dead. It lived in bloodlines. He was fascinated by the idea of racial memory, the belief that experiences, knowledge, and even trauma could be inherited biologically. In this worldview, women occupied a special role. They were not simply mothers. They were vessels, archives of the race, carrying its past into the future. The witch hunts, then, were not random outbreaks of hysteria. They were, according to Himmler's thinking, a targeted extermination of women who embodied an older, non-Christian worldview. This belief would become one of the strangest intellectual projects ever undertaken by a totalitarian state. To give the idea legitimacy, Himmler turned to an institution designed to blur the line between scholarship and ideology, Ahnenerbe. Officially, the Ahnenerbe was a research organization dedicated to the study of ancestral heritage. In practice, it functioned as a factory for pseudo-scientific narratives that supported Nazi racial theory. It sponsored archaeological expeditions, linguistic studies, folklore research, and biological experiments. Its findings were expected to confirm what the regime already believed, or wanted to believe. Within this structure, a special task force was created. Its name was deliberately bureaucratic, almost boring. Hexen-Sonderauftrag Special Assignment. Witches. The banality of the title masked the enormity of its ambition. The task was simple in concept and monstrous in implication. SS researchers were ordered to collect every available record of witch trials within German-speaking territories and beyond. They scoured archives across the Reich and occupied Europe, copying court transcripts, execution records, and church documents. Each case was catalogued, not to understand superstition, not to study legal history, but to extract patterns. The researchers classified victims by region, date, method of execution, and, most importantly, by what they believed to be racial characteristics. They mapped concentrations of executions onto areas the Nazis considered ethnically Germanic. The conclusion was predetermined. According to SS logic, the regions with the highest number of witch executions were proof of targeted racial destruction. The witch hunts, they claimed, were an early form of genocide, one carried out not with gas chambers, but with gallows and pyres. This interpretation served a critical function. It allowed the SS to portray itself not as a revolutionary force, but as a historical corrective. In this narrative, the SS was not inventing violence. It was avenging it. What makes the Hexen Files particularly chilling is their tone. They are not mystical texts. They contain no spells, no rituals, no invocations of demons. They are administrative documents, tables, summaries, statistics. Human lives reduced to data points. A woman burned in 1628 becomes a line in a spreadsheet. A confession extracted under torture becomes evidence of racial identity. This was not medieval superstition revived. It was modern bureaucracy applied to ancient terror. And that is what makes the project so dangerous. The irony is that the women whose suffering was being exploited had no voice in this reinterpretation. They were not rehabilitated. Their names were not restored. Their stories were not told. They were repurposed. Their deaths were folded into a myth that justified new forms of violence. This time, carried out by men in black uniforms, armed with filing cabinets instead of torches. The SS did not mourn the witches. It used them. By the early 1940s, as Germany's military fortunes began to waver, the witch project continued quietly in the background. The files grew thicker, the interpretations more elaborate, but the regime was becoming increasingly paranoid. Occultism, once tolerated when it served ideology, began to look dangerous when it escaped control. Astrologers and mystics who had once been consulted were now arrested. Independent esoteric circles were shut down. The SS would not allow competing narratives, even mystical ones. And so, like many Nazi projects, the Hexen-Sonderauftrag was never completed. The war ended. The Reich collapsed. The archives were seized, scattered, and forgotten. Almost. Today, fragments of these files remain in European archives, mute witnesses to an intellectual crime that never reached its final form. They reveal a regime that did not merely kill its enemies. It reimagined the dead to legitimize future murder. This story is not about whether witches were real. It is about what happens when power decides that history itself must be rewritten, no matter how many corpses it takes to do so. And it begins not with magic, but with paper. To understand why the SS became obsessed with witches, it is necessary to step away from images of bonfires and superstition and look instead at ideology. The Nazi state did not discover the witch hunts. It inherited them, reinterpreted them, and weaponized them. What mattered was not whether witches existed, but what their persecution could be made to represent. From the beginning, National Socialism positioned itself as a revolutionary force, not only against political enemies, but against entire systems of belief. Christianity, particularly in its Catholic form, occupied an uneasy place in this worldview. It could not be attacked outright without alienating large parts of the population, yet it was consistently portrayed as foreign, corrosive, and fundamentally incompatible with the racial future the regime imagined. The witch hunts offered a solution. For centuries, the persecution of witches had been explained as the product of religious hysteria, local fear, and judicial cruelty. In the Nazi reinterpretation, this explanation was incomplete to the point of being dishonest. The SS narrative reframed the witch trials as something deliberate and systematic, an early campaign of cultural annihilation carried out by the church and foreign legal systems against indigenous European traditions. In this version of history, the witch was no longer a criminal or a superstitious invention. She became a symbol. She represented pre-Christian Europe, a world supposedly rooted in blood, land, and ancestral knowledge. Her execution was not an act of justice gone wrong, but an act of conquest. This inversion was essential. It allowed the regime to claim continuity rather than rupture. The SS did not see itself as creating a new order from nothing. It saw itself as restoring one that had been violently destroyed. The Church, in this telling, was the true aggressor. According to SS ideologues, Christianity had not merely converted Europe, it had colonized it. It had imposed foreign values, suppressed local traditions, and broken the transmission of what they imagined as racial memory. The witch hunts were reframed as the most visible evidence of this crime. Women accused of witchcraft were recast as custodians of forbidden knowledge, healers, midwives, and ritual specialists whose existence threatened an imposed religious monopoly. There was no attempt to prove this claim in a modern historical sense. Instead, the SS relied on selective reading, ideological projection, and the authority of numbers. Thousands of executions could be cited. Maps could be drawn. Regions with high concentrations of witch trials could be labeled as centers of Germanic resistance, crushed by clerical violence. Facts were less important than coherence. The story only had to fit the racial worldview. In this narrative, the witch trials became a rehearsal for modern genocide. The methods differed, but the logic was the same. Identify a group defined as dangerous, dehumanize it through doctrine, and eliminate it under the guise of moral necessity. By presenting early modern Europe as a testing ground for this logic, the SS effectively normalized its own practices. Mass killing was no longer a modern aberration. It was tradition. This reinterpretation also served a second purpose. It redirected historical guilt. By focusing attention on medieval and early modern violence, the regime implied that brutality was not intrinsic to National Socialism, but embedded in Europe's Christian past. The SS, in contrast, presented itself as honest and unsentimental, willing to confront violence openly rather than disguising it behind theology. The witch, in this construction, was not redeemed. She was instrumentalized. Her suffering was acknowledged only insofar as it could be repurposed. The regime showed no interest in individual lives. Names mattered only as entries in ledgers. What mattered was scale. Tens of thousands of executions could be cited to create the impression of an ancient, coordinated assault on the race. The absence of centralized planning in the historical witch hunts was irrelevant. The SS supplied that coherence retroactively. Women occupied a particularly important place in this story. Nazi ideology defined women primarily by biology and reproduction, but it also assigned them a symbolic role. They were seen as carriers of continuity, transmitting not only genes, but values and identity. The idea that women had once held a central position in pre-Christian spiritual life fit neatly into this framework. By presenting executed women as guardians of ancestral knowledge, the SS could argue that the witch hunts were an attack on the biological and cultural future of the people. Killing witches was no longer just murder. It was an attempt to erase memory itself. This argument was powerful precisely Because it blurred categories. It mixed folklore with racial theory, history with mythology. It allowed the regime to speak about women's suffering while denying women agency in the present. It condemned violence committed by others while practicing violence on an industrial scale. The contradiction was not a flaw. It was the point. The church was never meant to defend itself in this narrative. Its role was fixed. It was portrayed as hierarchical, universalist, and hostile to blood-based identity. Whether Protestant or Catholic mattered less than the fact that Christianity, as a system, transcended ethnicity. For a regime obsessed with purity and separation, this universality was intolerable. The witch hunts, therefore, became proof that Christianity had always been incompatible with the racial order the SS sought to impose. They were evidence that the church did not merely misunderstand the people, it actively destroyed them. This framing allowed the SS to cast itself as a corrective force. Where the church had burned women, the SS claimed to honor their memory. Where Christianity had erased tradition, the SS claimed to recover it. The fact that this recovery took the form of archives, rather than protection, was carefully obscured. What mattered was symbolism. The witch was transformed from a marginal figure into a foundational myth. Her death explained everything that followed. If Europe had fallen into decadence, it was because its original spiritual order had been annihilated. If modern violence was necessary, it was because history had already been violent. Responsibility dissolved into inevitability. This way of thinking required no belief in magic. In fact, overt mysticism was often treated with suspicion. What the SS wanted was not spells or rituals, but legitimacy. The witch served as a historical witness who could not speak back. Her silence was convenient. The irony is that the very people whose deaths were being used to attack Christianity were often devout Christians themselves. Many of the accused prayed, confessed, and sought absolution. Their faith did not save them. In the SS narrative, this inconvenient detail was ignored. Individual belief was irrelevant. Only racial classification mattered. The regime did not ask who these women were. It decided what they must have been. By the time this interpretation had been formalized, it no longer mattered whether historians agreed. The SS was not interested in academic debate. It was interested in usable history. History that justified exclusion, hierarchy, and violence. The witch hunts offered a precedent that could not be undone. The dead could not contradict their reinterpretation. Documents could be refiled, motives could be reassigned. In doing so, the SS achieved something more dangerous than denial. It achieved appropriation. The past was not erased. It was conscripted. This chapter of the story matters because it shows how easily suffering can be repurposed by power. The Nazi state did not invent cruelty. It selected from history those forms of cruelty that could be made to serve its aims, stripped them of context, and recast them as proof. The witch became a mirror in which the SS saw itself, not as a criminal organization, but as an avenger. And that belief, more than any spell or superstition, shaped what followed. If the witch files gave the SS a usable myth, Heinrich Himmler gave that myth direction, authority, and permanence. More than any other figure in the Nazi hierarchy, Himmler believed that history was encoded not only in books and monuments, but in bodies. Blood, in his worldview, was not metaphor. It was archive. Himmler did not arrive at power as a mystic in robes or a prophet surrounded by incense. He was an administrator, trained in agriculture, meticulous to the point of obsession. He trusted paperwork, statistics, and classification. Yet behind this bureaucratic exterior was a belief system that rejected randomness. Everything he believed had an origin, a lineage, and a purpose. For Himmler, race was not simply biology. It was destiny remembered. He was fascinated by the idea that traits, instincts, and even memories could be inherited across generations. This belief, often referred to by SS theorists as blood memory, was never proven, but it did not need to be. It functioned as an explanatory framework that answered every question the regime asked. Why some people resisted authority, why others submitted, why cultures rose and fell. The answer was always the same. Blood carried memory, and memory determined fate. Within this framework, women occupied a unique and dangerous position. They were not merely reproducers of the race, they were its transmitters. If blood carried memory, then the female body was the medium through which that memory survived. This idea elevated women symbolically, while stripping them of agency. They mattered not as individuals, but as vessels. The witch myth fits seamlessly into this logic. Himmler believed that pre-Christian Europe had been organized around kinship, land, and ritual tied to nature. He imagined a world in which knowledge was passed orally, through families and communities, long before it was codified by institutions. In this imagined past, women held a central role, not as rulers, but as guardians of continuity. Healers, midwives, and ritual figures were recast as custodians of racial knowledge. The witch hunts, in this telling, were not chaotic outbreaks of fear. They were an attack on transmission itself. By killing women, the Church had severed the biological and cultural chain through which ancient knowledge flowed. This belief transformed the witch from a victim of history into a strategic figure in Nazi ideology. Her death explained loss. Her silence explained decline. Her suffering justified revenge. Himmler's fixation on this idea went beyond abstract theory. He sought places, symbols, and rituals that could embody it. The SS was not meant to be a conventional organization. It was designed as an order, bound not only by loyalty, but by shared myth. Nowhere was this more evident than at Wewelsburg Castle, which Himmler envisioned as the spiritual center of the SS. The castle was redesigned to serve as a ceremonial space, stripped of Christian symbols and infused with imagery drawn from a distorted vision of Germanic antiquity. Floors were engraved with runes. Rooms were assigned symbolic functions. History was not studied there. It was performed. In this environment, the witch trials were not distant events. They were living wounds. Himmler did not see himself as inventing a new religion. He believed he was restoring an interrupted one. Christianity, in his view, had overwritten Europe's original spiritual order. The SS would reverse that process, not by converting the population, but by re-educating the elite. The witch files played a crucial role in this effort. They provided raw material for a story that linked modern SS men to imagined ancestors. By portraying the witch hunts as racial persecution, Himmler could position the SS as heirs to an unfinished struggle. This struggle was not against specific people, but against forces. Universalism, egalitarianism, and any belief system that dissolved blood into abstraction. What made this belief system particularly dangerous was its internal consistency. Every element reinforced the others. If blood carried memory, then ancestry mattered more than education. If ancestry mattered more than education, then institutions claiming universal truth were suspect. If institutions were suspect, then violence against them could be framed as defensive. The witch became proof of concept. Himmler's personal correspondence and speeches reveal a man who saw himself as part of a long chain rather than a singular actor. He spoke of destiny, obligation, and inheritance. He encouraged SS officers to research their family trees, to marry selectively, to think of themselves as biological links in a historical mission. Within this mindset, the past was not past. It was dormant. The witch files were an attempt to awaken it. Yet there was a crucial contradiction at the heart of this obsession. The women executed as witches were not chosen because of race in any scientific sense. They were accused for reasons that ranged from personal vendettas to economic conflict. Many were elderly, poor, or socially isolated. Their deaths had little to do with ancestry. Himmler was aware of this inconsistency. It did not trouble him. Ideology does not require accuracy. It requires plausibility. The SS did not need the witch hunts to be racially motivated. It needed them to be interpretable as such. Selective reading, omission, and reinterpretation were sufficient. Documents were stripped of context and reassembled into a narrative that appeared coherent because it was closed to contradiction. This is where Himmler's bureaucratic instincts proved decisive. The witch files were not poetic or mystical. They were orderly. Tables replaced testimony. Statistics replaced stories. Violence became quantifiable. By reducing centuries of suffering to data, Himmler transformed moral outrage into administrative logic. Killing was no longer shocking if it could be historicized. The SS was not committing atrocities. It was correcting history's course. This logic also explains why the regime never attempted to rehabilitate the executed women. There were no memorials, no apologies, no efforts to restore names or dignity. Rehabilitation would have required recognizing individuality. Individuality threatened the myth. The women were valuable only as a category. As the war progressed and the demands on the SS intensified, Himmler's tolerance for uncontrolled mysticism diminished. Independent occultists and astrologers, once consulted, began to look like rivals. They offered narratives that did not flow through the SS hierarchy. Blood memory could not be allowed to speak freely. The regime responded predictably. Esoteric groups were shut down. Astrologers were arrested. Mystics who claimed independent authority disappeared. The SS retained the myth, but eliminated the mythmakers. This was not a rejection of belief. It was a consolidation of power. The witch files survived this purge because they were silent. They did not predict the future. They explained the past. And explanation, unlike prophecy, could be controlled. Himmler's obsession with blood memory did not end with witches. It informed policies on marriage, reproduction, and settlement. It justified displacement and extermination. It provided a language in which mass murder could be discussed as necessity rather than choice. The witch was one chapter in a much larger story, but it was a revealing one. It showed how easily the dead could be recruited into ideology, how suffering could be repurposed as justification, and how history could be transformed from warning into weapon. Himmler did not need to believe in spells. He believed in continuity, and in that belief, he found permission. By the time the Reich collapsed, his vision of blood memory had failed in practical terms. The war was lost. The SS was dismantled. The order he imagined never materialized, but the documents remained. And in those files, the logic is still visible. A logic that does not ask whether something is true, only whether it is useful. That logic did not die in 1945. It waits quietly in archives. The Hexen Sonderauftrag did not announce itself with slogans or ceremonies. It arrived quietly, as most bureaucratic horrors do, in the form of memos, requisitions, and filing instructions. There was no dramatic declaration that the SS would now investigate witches. There was simply a task to be completed, resources assigned, and deadlines implied rather than stated. Its existence is known not because it was meant to be public, but because it followed procedure. The SS treated the project as a research operation, and research in the Nazi state left paperwork. Orders were issued to regional offices. Archivists were contacted. Local administrators were instructed to cooperate. Church archives, municipal registries, and court repositories were opened, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes under pressure. The aim was totality. Partial collections were useless. Gaps were treated as failures. What emerged from this process was not a narrative, but a mass of raw material. Trial transcripts from the 16th and 17th centuries were copied or summarized. Execution records were cataloged. Confessions, often extracted under torture, were reproduced without commentary. Names were stripped of biography and reduced to entries. Women became numbers. Numbers became patterns. The SS researchers did not ask whether the confessions were reliable. They were not interested in psychology or legal abuse. The witch hunts were approached as a demographic event. Who was executed? Where? When? And most importantly, in what concentration? This statistical obsession was deliberate. Numbers create authority. They imply objectivity. By translating suffering into data, the SS transformed moral catastrophe into administrative evidence. The archives grew rapidly. Thousands of cases were collected, with a clear emphasis on regions considered ethnically Germanic. The geographic distribution of executions was mapped and compared against the SS's own racial cartography. Where the two overlapped, conclusions were drawn. Where they did not, anomalies were ignored. The process was circular, but effective. If a region with a high number of witch executions was designated as Germanic, this confirmed that witches were racially targeted. If a region did not fit the pattern, it was either excluded from analysis or explained away as insufficiently documented. The archive did not test hypotheses. It validated assumptions. Within the files, the language is revealing. Victims are rarely described as individuals. They are referred to as subjects, cases, or material. Their deaths are not tragedies. They are indicators. The violence inflicted upon them is not questioned. It is simply noted. This is where the Hexensonderauftrag departs most clearly from historical inquiry. Traditional historians, even those working within flawed frameworks, attempt to understand context. The SS had no interest in context. Context complicates. Context introduces ambiguity. Ambiguity was the enemy. The witch trials were reframed as an organized campaign against a population defined not by belief, but by blood. The fact that historical witch hunts varied widely in motivation and method did not matter. The SS narrative required uniformity, and uniformity was imposed retroactively. One of the most striking features of the archive is its selective blindness. Men accused of witchcraft appear in the records, but they are marginal. The focus remains overwhelmingly on women. This emphasis was not accidental. Women fit the ideological role assigned to them. Men did not. By centering women, the SS could argue that the witch hunts were an attack on reproduction, continuity, and inheritance. Killing women was not just murder. It was sabotage of the future. This interpretation aligned perfectly with Nazi anxieties about demographic decline and racial dilution. The archive did not prove this claim. It suggested it. Suggestion was enough. The SS also ignored the fact that witch hunts were often driven by local conflicts, economic tensions, and personal vendettas. These explanations did not serve ideology. They fragmented responsibility. They localized guilt. The Nazi narrative required a single, external enemy. That enemy was institutional Christianity. Church courts, clerical authorities, and religious rhetoric were emphasized wherever possible. Even in regions where secular courts carried out executions, religious influence was highlighted. The goal was not accuracy. It was coherence. The Hexensonderauftrag thus became an exercise in historical compression. Centuries of disparate events were collapsed into a single, continuous assault. Time was flattened. Motive was unified. Complexity was erased. What replaced it was a story. This story did not exist to rehabilitate the dead. It existed to educate the living. Within the SS, the archive functioned as a training tool. It demonstrated how history could be mobilized, how documents could be repurposed, how moral outrage could be redirected. The witch files taught SS officers that the past was malleable and that malleability was power. The project also revealed the regime's confidence. The SS did not fear contradiction. It assumed authority over interpretation itself. Competing historical narratives were dismissed as either naive or malicious. Scholars who disagreed were irrelevant. The archive spoke with the voice of the state. And yet, for all its ambition, the Hexen-Sonderauftrag was deeply fragile. It relied entirely on control of documents, control of interpretation, control of dissemination. The moment that control weakened, the narrative risked collapse. This fragility explains why the project remained largely internal. There was no mass campaign to publicize the witch reinterpretation. It circulated among SS ideologues and planners, not the general population. The myth was intended for the elite. The regime understood that this narrative was too radical, too destabilizing to be widely shared. Accusing Christianity of historical genocide challenged a foundation of European identity. It was a tool meant to harden the SS, not to convert society overnight. The archive thus occupied a liminal space. It was neither secret nor public. It existed in the gray zone where ideology incubates. As the war intensified, the project continued, but its urgency diminished. Resources were redirected. Personnel were reassigned. The files accumulated, but conclusions were never finalized. The narrative remained incomplete, waiting for a victory that never came. When the Reich collapsed, the archive fragmented. Some documents were seized by Allied forces. Others were lost, destroyed, or quietly absorbed into post-war collections. The story the SS had planned to tell was never fully told. What remains are traces. Folders without conclusions, tables without summaries, evidence without verdicts. This incompleteness is telling. It reveals that the Hexen-Sonderauftrag was not an academic failure. It was a political one. The regime ran out of time, but the logic that produced it did not disappear with the files. The Witch Archive demonstrates a method rather than a belief. A method of taking real suffering, stripping it of context, and reassigning it meaning. A method of transforming victims into symbols and symbols into justification. That method does not require witches. It only requires archives and an authority willing to decide what the past means. For all its claims to rationality and science, the Third Reich existed in a permanent state of anxiety about the future. Military planning could predict logistics and supply lines, but it could not guarantee destiny. Ideology promised inevitability, yet events remained stubbornly unpredictable. Into this gap stepped a class of figures who were never fully acknowledged and never entirely dismissed. Prophets, astrologers, fortune-tellers, and occult practitioners, many of them women. They were not part of any official SS hierarchy. There were no uniforms, no ranks, no formal titles. Their presence was irregular, unofficial, and often deniable. Yet they existed close enough to power to matter, and far enough from it to be sacrificed. The Nazi regime did not create these people. Germany in the 1920s and 1930s was saturated with esoteric movements. Astrology columns appeared in newspapers. Folk healers and clairvoyants operated openly. The trauma of defeat in the First World War and the collapse of old certainties created fertile ground for belief systems that promised hidden order beneath chaos. National Socialism inherited this environment and selectively exploited it. What distinguished the regime was not belief, but control. Occult practices were tolerated only insofar as they served ideology or personal obsession at the top. They were never meant to become independent sources of authority. Women occupied a peculiar position in this landscape. They were simultaneously idealized and distrusted. Nazi ideology portrayed women as intuitive, closer to nature, and biologically suited to continuity rather than abstraction. These stereotypes made female occult practitioners both attractive and dangerous. On the one hand, they embodied the regime's romanticized vision of ancient wisdom. On the other, they threatened to claim access to knowledge outside state supervision. Some women were consulted privately by high-ranking officials. Astrology was used to select dates, assess personal compatibility, or interpret perceived omens. Numerology, palmistry, and various forms of divination circulated in elite circles. These practices were rarely documented in official records, precisely because documentation created accountability. The regime's relationship with prophecy was pragmatic. Predictions were welcome when they aligned with expectations. When they did not, the problem was not the prediction, but the predictor. This conditional tolerance created an atmosphere of fear and dependency. Occult practitioners understood that their survival depended on usefulness. They adjusted language, softened conclusions, and framed insights in ways that reinforced existing beliefs. Prophecy became performance. Yet even controlled prophecy carried risk. The Third Reich presented itself as inevitable. Its ideology left little room for uncertainty. Any suggestion of failure, collapse, or defeat, even couched in mystical language, posed a threat. A prophecy that could not be reconciled with official optimism was inherently subversive. This tension intensified as the war progressed. In the early years, when victories came quickly, occult interests could be indulged. Astrological consultations were curiosities, not challenges. But as the tide turned, tolerance vanished. The future was no longer something to explore. It was something to enforce. At this point, the same state that had flirted with mysticism began to repress it. Astrologers were arrested. Fortune-tellers were accused of spreading defeatism. Independent, esoteric groups were dismantled. What had once been framed as ancient wisdom was reclassified as fraud or sabotage. The regime could not allow competing explanations for events it no longer controlled. Women were particularly vulnerable in this shift. Lacking official protection, they could be discarded without consequence. Some disappeared into prisons. Others were silenced. Their earlier proximity to power became evidence against them. The irony is striking. The same ideology that romanticized women as carriers of ancestral knowledge ultimately punished them for claiming access to it. This reversal reveals a deeper truth about the Nazi relationship with occult power. It was never about belief. It was about monopoly. The state could tolerate mysticism only when mysticism reinforced state authority. The moment it suggested autonomy, it became intolerable. This logic mirrors the treatment of the witch in SS ideology. The historical witch was admired not as an individual, but as a symbol. The modern occult practitioner was useful only as an instrument. In both cases, agency was forbidden. The regime's fear was not superstition. It was unpredictability. Prophecy introduces variables. It opens futures that cannot be fully managed. For a totalitarian system, this is unacceptable. The future must appear predetermined, even when it is not. By eliminating independent prophets, the regime attempted to reclaim narrative control. History would be rewritten through archives. The future would be dictated through orders. Anything that resisted this structure would be erased. This explains why the witch files survived, while living mystics did not. The dead could not contradict ideology. The living could. The women who once claimed insight into fate were reduced to cautionary examples. Their existence was denied, then criminalized. The same society that had quietly sought their guidance now treated them as liabilities. What remains is silence. There are no official lists of these women, no comprehensive records. Their stories survive only in fragments, in rumors, in post-war testimonies. This absence is itself revealing. It shows how thoroughly the regime erased what it could not control. The SS Witch Archive, by contrast, was preserved precisely because it posed no risk. It spoke only of the past, and only in the language approved by power. It did not predict, it justified. This distinction between controlled myth and uncontrolled belief marks the boundary of tolerance in the Third Reich. Women associated with prophecy crossed that boundary. They were never meant to shape destiny, only to reflect it. In the end, the regime rejected even the illusion of occult uncertainty. What remained was a system that relied solely on force, administration, and terror. Myth was retained only in its most rigid, sanitized form. The witch survived as symbol. The prophet did not. This chapter matters because it exposes the final contradiction in the Nazi use of mysticism. The regime claimed access to ancient knowledge, yet destroyed anyone who might interpret it independently. It celebrated intuition, yet punished those who trusted it. It invoked destiny, yet could not tolerate doubt. The occult, stripped of autonomy, became decoration, a language without voice. And when the war reached its final stages, even decoration was unnecessary. Only obedience remained. By the early 1940s, the atmosphere inside the Third Reich had changed. What had once been framed as destiny now felt increasingly like improvisation under pressure. Victories were no longer swift. The future, once declared inevitable, began to fracture under the weight of events the regime could not fully explain or control. In this environment, mysticism ceased to be a curiosity and became a liability. The same leadership that had tolerated esoteric interests when they reinforced confidence now viewed them with suspicion. Astrology, prophecy, and divination carried an unacceptable risk. They could produce answers the state did not authorize. And answers, in a system built on absolute narrative control, were dangerous. The crackdown did not come with a single announcement. As with so many Nazi reversals, it arrived through administrative language. New regulations limited superstitious practices. Police directives authorized investigations into fortune-telling. Newspapers quietly stopped printing astrological content. What had been fashionable was now suspect. The Gestapo began compiling lists. Astrologers were accused of undermining morale. Fortune-tellers were charged with spreading defeatism. Mystics, who claimed insight into the war's outcome, were treated not as eccentrics, but as potential saboteurs. The justification was simple. Predicting failure was equivalent to wishing for it. The irony was unmistakable. A regime built on myth now treated myth as treason. This reversal exposed the true function mysticism had served all along. It was never meant to inform decision-making. It existed to reassure, to decorate ideology with a sense of ancient inevitability. Once reassurance failed, mysticism became redundant. Women, once again, bore the brunt of this shift. Female astrologers and clairvoyants were disproportionately targeted. Their marginal status made them easy to arrest and hard to defend. Unlike academics or officials, they had no institutional protection. Their work was informal, often undocumented. This made accusations effortless. Some were imprisoned, others were forced into silence. In a few cases, post-war testimonies suggest harsher outcomes. The records are incomplete, but the pattern is clear. The regime eliminated what it could not regulate. This purge was not an abandonment of ideology. It was an enforcement of hierarchy. Only the state could interpret destiny. The SS witch files, notably, were unaffected. They did not threaten the future. They did not speak. They existed entirely within the regime's control, offering a fixed interpretation of the past. Their usefulness remained intact. Living mystics, by contrast, represented variability. They could revise their claims. They could change their minds. They could react to events in real time. This adaptability, which might seem harmless in another context, was intolerable under totalitarianism. Control required rigidity. As the war dragged on, the regime's tolerance for ambiguity shrank to zero. Even symbolic elements that once lent grandeur to SS culture were stripped away or simplified. Runes remained, but ritual diminished. Myth was reduced to slogan. The turning point was psychological as much as political. The leadership no longer wanted explanations. It wanted obedience. Mysticism had promised insight without accountability. In crisis, that promise became unacceptable. The state demanded loyalty expressed through action, not interpretation. Those who claimed special knowledge of fate challenged that demand. The suppression of occult practitioners also served a disciplinary function. It reminded elites that proximity to power did not equal immunity. The same system that had indulged their interests could destroy them without warning. Fear replaced fascination. This was not unique to mysticism. Artists, intellectuals, and even military officers experienced similar reversals when their usefulness waned. What makes the occult purge distinctive is how clearly it reveals the regime's instrumental mindset. Belief was acceptable only as long as it obeyed. The witch, once mythologized as a victim of Christian violence, remained safely dead. Her role in ideology was secure precisely because she could not contradict it. The modern mystic, alive and unpredictable, had no such protection. The past could be rewritten. The present could not. By the final years of the war, the Third Reich had little use for mythology beyond the most basic narratives of sacrifice and endurance. The elaborate pseudo-historical constructions that had fascinated SS ideologues in the 1930s faded into irrelevance. Survival took precedence over symbolism. Yet the purge did not erase what had been done. The witch files remained. The logic that produced them remained. Even as mysticism was suppressed, the ideological framework that treated history as a weapon continued to operate. This is the paradox at the heart of the Nazi relationship with the occult. The regime did not abandon myth because it discovered reason. It abandoned myth because myth, when uncontrolled, threatened authority. The Witch Archive was not mystical. It was administrative. It reduced belief to data and memory to classification. That made it safe. The living mystic, by contrast, could reinterpret signs. She could suggest alternatives. She could imply futures not sanctioned by the state. That made her dangerous. In this sense, the purge was inevitable. Totalitarian systems cannot tolerate competing explanations for reality. Whether those explanations are religious, scientific, or mystical is irrelevant. What matters is authorship. Only one voice is permitted to define meaning. The Reich turned on its own mystics, not because it ceased to believe, but because it could no longer afford belief that it did not control. This distinction matters because it reveals how easily ideology adapts. The regime did not contradict itself. It refined itself. Mysticism was useful when it supported certainty. It was eliminated when it introduced doubt. The witch files survived because they offered certainty without challenge. They transformed chaotic history into a single, linear accusation. They turned complexity into confirmation, and confirmation was all the regime needed. As the war ended and the Reich collapsed, the fate of the mystics faded into obscurity. Their stories were never fully recorded. Their names rarely appear in archives. Their erasure was almost complete. What remains is the structure that erased them, a structure that prized silence over insight, order over understanding, control over truth. The witch survived only as a myth shaped by power. The mystic did not survive at all. The Hexensonderauftrag was designed as a project without an end date, but it was never meant to remain unfinished. The SS expected victory, and victory would have given the witch files their final purpose, official canonization. The archive was supposed to move from internal research to ideological doctrine, from folders to policy, from interpretation to justification. That moment never came. As the war turned against Germany, priorities shifted rapidly. Manpower was drained from research units. Resources were diverted to immediate military needs. The administrative machinery that had sustained long-term ideological projects began to fracture under pressure. The Witch Archive did not collapse dramatically. It simply stalled. Files continued to be collected, but synthesis slowed. Conclusions were drafted, but not finalized. Memoranda referenced future publications that were never written. The project entered a state of suspension, waiting for conditions that would never materialize. This unfinished state is revealing. The SS did not abandon the witch files because they were disproven or discredited. On the contrary, within the internal logic of SS ideology, the project remained valid. What failed was not the idea, but the regime's capacity to complete its own myth-making. The archive required stability. It required time. It required a future in which interpretation could harden into doctrine. War destroyed all three. There was also a deeper problem. The witch files, if fully formalized, would have forced the regime to confront uncomfortable implications. By framing the witch hunts as genocide, the SS implicitly created a historical mirror. The logic it applied to the past could easily be applied to the present. The comparison was useful rhetorically, but dangerous philosophically. Genocide explained too much. It risked collapsing moral distinctions the regime needed to preserve. If medieval Europe could be accused of extermination, then modern Europe might one day accuse the Reich of the same. The witch files were powerful as internal justification, but risky as public doctrine. Keeping them incomplete preserved ambiguity. As Allied forces advanced, the fate of the archive became uncertain. Some documents were evacuated, others were destroyed. Many were simply abandoned as offices were evacuated in haste. The SS did not attempt to stage manage their legacy. Survival took precedence over narrative control. After 1945, the witch files entered a new phase of existence. They were no longer ideological weapons. They became evidence. Allied investigators encountered fragments of the project while cataloging SS records. To outside observers, the witch files appeared bizarre, even absurd. A regime responsible for industrial mass murder had devoted energy to medieval superstition. The temptation was to dismiss the project as the eccentricity. That dismissal was a mistake. The witch archive was not an anomaly. It was a window into how the regime thought. It showed that violence was not only physical, but interpretive. The SS did not merely kill people. It reclassified their deaths, reassigned meaning, and repurposed suffering across centuries. The incompleteness of the project does not diminish its significance. It sharpens it. The files show a regime attempting to extend its authority backward in time, to claim ownership not only of territory and population, but of memory itself. The past was treated as raw material, subject to the same principles of extraction and control as land or labor. That ambition exceeded even the Reich's capacity. In the end, the witch files failed, not because they were implausible, but because the system that produced them collapsed before it could finish speaking. History interrupted ideology. The witches did not return. The women whose names filled the SS folders were not restored to dignity or truth. They remained what they had always been to power: silent, useful, disposable. The SS did not uncover hidden wisdom in the witch trials. It uncovered a method for transforming mass suffering into narrative capital, a method for stripping violence of context and assigning it purpose, a method for converting history into justification. No spells were required. The most dangerous magic the Nazis practiced was not occultism, but interpretation. They showed how easily the past could be conscripted, how quickly victims could be transformed into symbols, and how symbols could be weaponized. The witch files were never about witches. They were about permission to believe that violence was inherited, permission to see murder as correction, permission to treat history not as warning, but as mandate. That is why this story matters, because archives still exist, because interpretation still carries power, because the past, when stripped of context, can be made to say almost anything. The SS failed to finish its witch doctrine, but the logic that guided it did not disappear. It reappears whenever history is flattened into myth, Whenever complexity is sacrificed for certainty, whenever suffering is reused to justify new harm. The women burned centuries ago could not speak for themselves. The SS spoke for them and lied. And the lie was simple, that the dead can be owned. They cannot, but they can be used. And that is the real legacy of the Nazi witch files.